Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm happy to share with you some work that we've been conducting as part of a VR project on the trade-offs for society, the environment, and economics of European agriculture. Today, I'm focusing on work that I've done together with my colleagues Mark Brady and Murray Scown, looking at the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and subsidies and how those could be reformed or transformed for increased sustainability. Just as a bit of background, the CAP is the European Union's largest budget item. So it's an average of over 50 billion euros a year for the last few decades. It's almost 40% of the European Union budget. So the largest share of the tax money that we as European citizens pay into the EU goes to support the Common Agricultural Policy. And this reflects the critical foundational role of agriculture in society. But today, the CAP is widely criticized and riddled with problems. The policies are not well organized and synthesized, so there's a bias towards production as opposed to overall societal benefits and well-being for nature. The food that is produced contributes to health problems, including unhealthy food and excessive unhealthy food that leads to health problems like obesity and non-communicable diseases. We know that agriculture causes and land use causes about a quarter of global emissions of greenhouse gases, and it contributes thereby to climate change, as well as being vulnerable to climate change. So there's also a rural and social sustainability problem with agriculture in Europe, where there's an aging and primarily male-dominated population. So the vision for the CAP, for it to become sustainable, would be to integrate policies that connect people and nature to produce sustainable and healthy food and thereby protect both human and environmental health, to adopt practices and incentivize practices, farming practices that protect the environment, and to support thriving rural landscapes where people are able to work on the land and there's a diverse group involved in farming. So that's the challenge that we face. This diagram is familiar to many in this audience, made by colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center, showing how the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals can be visualized as contributing or essential as a basis of the food system, and how ideally the food system would and should be contributing to all of these goals. Some writers have claimed that the food system is or could be already doing this, but that was a claim that we wanted to look at and investigate in our work. But I think a really important point here is that there's an environmental and biospheric foundation for both human and natural well-being, that basically humans, our society is embedded within the biosphere and our economy is embedded within that. So we need to have our order of priorities right in order to be working towards sustainability. In work led by Murray Scown, we developed a method to actually quantitatively assess how policies, including the CAP and other agricultural and environmental policies, are in fact contributing to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals today. And this is important because it's often been claimed or assessments have been done based on expert elicitation, for example. But what we did is actually go to the policies themselves and look at the indicators that are used in the policies and align them with the indicators used in the SDGs. So in order to do this, for example, we show here what our method demonstrates, the 100 European Union version indicators of the SDGs, how those align, for example, with the CAP, where they look at and measure and monitor the same thing, for example, nitrates in groundwater or risk of poverty. And then we also identified gaps where, for example, the EU Sustainable Development Goals focus on toxic chemicals and climate-related economic losses, both very relevant for agriculture, but actually the CAP is not measuring or monitoring those indicators. So conversely, there are instances where the CAP is measuring something that could be related to sustainability and is missed out. So those we classified as not aligned. And it may not be the case that every EU Sustainable Development Goal needs to be, or every aspect, every indicator needs to be covered by the CAP, but we wanted to see how well this is done today. And what we found is that at the moment, the CAP is really not optimized or not fit for purpose to contribute to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in Europe. So our current agricultural policy in Europe is very heavily focused on just a few areas. Those are including SDG 2, which has to do with agricultural production and zero hunger, and SDG 15 focused on biodiversity. Those are we found 5 indicators for each of those. But most other sustainable development goals only included 1 indicator, or 4 were actually missing indicators entirely. So at the moment, the Common Agricultural Policy is not looking at important issues like health, gender equality, life below water, despite these really important connections between the goals of the CAP, the goals that society has for the food system, and the need to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So one conclusion from this, or one suggestion here, is to better integrate and make use of existing indicators that would align existing policies. So in this case, the CAP and the Sustainable Development Goals. And in order to do that, we identified, in work led by Clara Winkler, we identified 32 core variables that at the moment are already studied in both academia, policy, and practice. So Murray Scown also led some of this work, putting all the pieces together. And basically here our suggestion is research in the food system should include these categories that we show here on the left. So things like soil, water, landscape composition, as well as all these social variables, looking at the workforce, for example, and demographic structure. These are the core elements to understand the food system as an integrated social ecological system. And at the moment, many of these are often missed out, but there are existing indicators that are shared, which are shown here under these 3 columns of drivers, management choices, and outcomes. So these are widely measured and studied both within research papers, which we found through a systematic review, as well as in European policies and in tools used by farmers in practice to inform their management. So we suggest as a starting point, these 32 variables are important to include in study design, and perhaps to fill in any gaps to make sure that the study design is comprehensive and will be able to give, when you're looking at the food system, be able to give meaningful information about how that food system is contributing both to human and environmental well-being. Turning now to some of our most recent work, where we focused on an analysis of the money and goals of the CAP itself. So this is that roughly 55 or so billion euros per year that are going towards supporting the farming system. What we show here is, working from the left, there's a division between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is basically income support for farmers, and that's the majority of funding. Pillar 2 is a wide variety of measures, but mostly focused on environmental benefit, rural development, and sort of the non-income goals of the CAP. Here we have these 9 modern objectives of the CAP. What is the CAP trying to achieve? Here we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And then here is what the CAP is actually measuring and monitoring and evaluating. So the indicators we have to see how the CAP is performing. And basically what this shows is that, first of all, there's a misalignment between how the money is spent and the objectives of the CAP and the SDGs. So basically most of the money is going directly to income support. That only supports 2 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Conversely, the small amount of money, about 1/4 of the money that is going to these diverse goals like climate change action, environmental care, vibrant rural areas, those actually do a lot to support many of the Sustainable Development Goals. But a further problem is the CAP at the moment is not very good at measuring and evaluating performance towards these goals. So the indicators that are measured are not very well aligned with either the Sustainable Development Goals, or indeed, in some cases, the objectives here. So the majority of the indicators, as you see here, that are being measured for the CAP are not actually giving us meaningful information about its performance in terms of moving towards sustainability. And that's a problem. So we need to better measure and evaluate indicators that are telling us something meaningful about the goals we're trying to achieve with this policy. From an analysis, for the first time, the CAP has really been something of a black box, and the payments, although required by law to be transparently publicly reported, are kind of shrouded in mystery because they're very difficult to access. Each country or member state uses a different reporting scheme. They are reported in, I believe, 14 different original languages, and there until now has been no central source to actually integrate and harmonize these data so they can be compared apples to apples. So for example, you can see for across the whole European Union, which countries have received money for which measures, and where geographically within a country, not just at the country level, where are those payments being made. So that's a database that we've now created and published. In this paper from last year, we used these data to analyze the spending according to a few important sustainability goals, namely income inequality, climate action, and biodiversity. And what we showed is that something like 40% of current CAP payments, so more than 26 billion euros, is actually misspent. It is going to increase income inequality. The reason being that most of the payments are going to areas where farm income is already higher than the European average. And what that means is that the farmers who already are making a better than average living on the market are further being enriched by these farm payments, whereas the lowest income farmers in these red areas here who would most need income support are not receiving enough to make a meaningful difference. So therefore, the income inequality between those two groups is actually exacerbated and made worse by CAP farm payments. Secondly, we showed that very little money is actually going to measures that are meant to support biodiversity or climate action. And that is, of course, a big problem because particularly with the new farm to fork strategy and other European policies, the goal and the claim from the European Commission is that the common agricultural policy should and in fact does support climate action and biodiversity. But unfortunately, our data show that at the moment that is not the case, that there's actually relatively little of this overall budget that is going to climate friendly or biodiversity friendly farming. And in fact, quite the reverse, that often payments are concentrated in areas of highest pollution. So we found that something like 15 billion euros in total could be, less than 8 billion euros, is used to support these climate and biodiversity friendly farming. And that's around 15% of the total CAP budget for this year, 2015, that we looked at. The problem is that the Commission now claims that up to 40% of the budget should in fact be spent on climate action, but we don't see evidence from the latest CAP reforms that any changes have been made to make that happen. So CAP reform is urgently needed in order to align payments with social goals. If you're interested in these data, we've published them open access, including the methods and the process we use to develop this data set. And we relied here on a lot of hard work by over a decade of volunteers primarily who have worked for farmsubsidy.org and other transparency organizations. So we're very grateful that they started this work and assembled the data that allowed us to be able to put it together. And it was a lot of work to make, so I very much hope that anyone interested will make use of the data set we've created. So to sum up then, I want to make 4 points. It's important that we have and develop and are explicit about a shared agenda for sustainable food systems that explicitly incorporates both human health and the health and well-being of nature. We have to simultaneously solve both of those goals. I advocate that we should be using existing indicators to measure and monitor progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which we have, and we cite sources for where those can be found. But doing so would really enable us to assess how well our policies serving us, how efficiently is this money being spent, which policies are making the biggest difference, and which in fact are not contributing to social goals that they're meant to achieve. And then in terms of subsidy reform, a really basic point is that we need incentives, political and regulatory incentives, that make it cheaper to do the right thing than the wrong thing. And at the moment, we don't have that either in energy, where fossil fuels continue to be subsidized, or in agriculture, where the subsidy systems that we have are reinforcing a harmful system of industrialized agriculture that is really harming the planet as well as human health. So in order to make those subsidies or public payments actually align with public benefit, we have 2 major suggestions. The first is that income support in farming should be needs-based, so that it is in fact meeting the goal of making it possible and supporting making a living in farming without exacerbating income inequality. And secondly, that environmental payments should be results-based, meaning that instead of paying for adopting specific measures, society should be incentivizing and paying farmers for the results that they achieve on their farm, so that, for example, carbon is actually sequestered or biodiversity and habitat is actually protected. And that means we have to be more thoughtful about the measures we apply where. I'll end by saying I would invite you for some of the thinking behind these results and a friendly and accessible translation of them. I would love to have you subscribe to my monthly climate and biodiversity newsletter, which is called We Can Fix It on Substack. And I really dive into these issues in my new book, which is called Under the Sky We Make. So very welcome to check out those resources. And I'll close by letting you know where you can find the papers that I've cited here on my website and also published open access. Please do make use of the data and feel free to get in touch with any questions. Thanks so much.